Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of the Climate Change and Migration course. It's great to have you with us again. And what I'm going to do is just wait a couple of minutes to make sure that everyone who wants to join us is on the live stream. And then we will begin the session proper. So what I want to do is just make sure that everyone can hear me. So if someone could indicate in the chat that they can hear, that would be great. And what I'm going to do now is share my screen, and hopefully in a second you will be able to see my slides, and then we will make a start. So I'm going to share my screen now. And begin the presentation. So, as I said, thanks for joining us. And before we begin the session, I'm going to do a very quick recap on what we looked at last month, and then we'll start on the content of this session. So if you remember, last month, I basically gave an outline of the entire course, and we explored what we would be exploring over the year by delving into some testimonies from people who have moved in the context of climate change, people who've been displaced, people who have migrated, and whose movement has been in some way linked to our changing climate. The purpose of that was really to do two things. The first one was to show you some of the real experiences of people who migrate and to understand their motivation, to understand the forces that have driven them to move, to understand their experiences, and really to hear in their own words why they moved, why they made the choices they did, the circumstances in which they found themselves, and the way they viewed their own migratory experience. And that's something that we'll be coming back to. The experiences of people who migrate or are displaced by climate change is something that we're going to draw on quite extensively over the year. The second purpose of doing that exploration of the testimonies was also to show you how and where we would be delving into the various issues that we're going to cover. So if you recall, we looked at a number of testimonies, and with each one, I indicated where in the course over the year we would be exploring some of the issues raised by that testimony in more depth. So I'm going to begin now by looking at what we're going to do this session. The purpose of the session that we're about to have really has three things. The first one is to provide you with a very brief overview of some of the key concepts in the field of migration, to understand some of the key terminology that we use when we're talking about migration, displacement, and human movement. The second thing is to provide a very, very quick overview of some of the basics of climate change, what climate change is, how it's caused, and the kind of impacts that it's going to have. So what I'm going to ask is that if you feel like you already know a lot about one of these things, then please do bear with us. We're a real mix of people on this course. Some people who have a solid grounding in issues around migration, but perhaps less so on climate change, and then people who have the opposite experience, lots of knowledge about climate change, but less so about migration. So the purpose of the beginning of this session is really to get us all to the same place so that we have common understanding both of migration, and we understand some of the terminology that we're going to be using, and similarly with climate change, so that we all understand at least the basics of some of the science, some of the causes, and some of the impacts. What we're then going to do is delve into exactly how climate change is going to alter patterns of migration. So this is really key stuff, and it's quite key to the understanding of the rest of the course that we get to grips with exactly what these new trends in migration and displacement are going to be. And that will really provide most of the second half of this session. So about half the session looking at the basics and terminology of migration and then climate change. And then about half the session looking at how those climate change impacts are going to alter patterns of migration and displacement. Then at the end, we will have a brief Q&A session. So as ever, please feel free to post comments in the chat section, which you should be able to see just to the right of your video screen. My colleague Leanne is here with me as well, and she will be responding to some of your chat questions as we go along. And then at the end, Leanne will relay some of the questions that you've posed to me in chat during the session, and I will do my best to answer those. I should also say that after the session, in the next week, I'll be sending out another email which will have the link to this video so that you can watch it again if you need to, and as per last time, a short task that you can do if you wish, the aim of which will be to give you the chance to deepen your understanding of what we've done in this session in your own time. So do keep an eye on your inboxes after this session for the link to rewatch if you want to, and for the task that you can use to deepen your own understanding going forward. So what I'm going to do now is just begin the session by looking at some of the key migration concepts. So what we're really doing here is getting to grips with the terminology around migration and displacement and some of the key concepts that are used to understand what migration and displacement are. This is really important because we're going to be using this language a lot in this session and over the whole course. So one of the really, really important distinctions in this whole field of human mobility is the difference between migration and displacement. And the best way to understand this is that at one hand of our spectrum, we have migration, and we have a form of human movement there that is freely chosen. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have displacement as a form of human movement which is not chosen. So sometimes it helps to give some kind of really stark examples just to illustrate what the difference is here. So we can imagine individual people's migration where they have undertaken that migration with a huge amount of choice and a huge amount of freedom. So for example, we can see people who are perhaps very, very wealthy choosing to live in different countries across the world because that suits them, because that enables them to continue earning more money, perhaps just because they like a particular country or particular city, and they have the choice, they have the wealth that they need in order to go and live there. That is a form of migration, but it is a form of migration which is absolutely chosen by the people who undertake it. At the very other end of the spectrum, we have people moving really just to ensure their immediate survival. Their movement is a choice between staying put and suffering the consequences of that, which could be injury or death, and moving in order to make sure that they survive. They have very little choice about moving, and the movement that they undertake really doesn't come with any choice or any freedom. It is really forced. We can then, of course, imagine other places, intermediate places along this spectrum where people have more or less choice about the movement that they undertake. So when people move, they're not just making a decision about where they move to, they're also making decisions about who they move with, whether they move with family and friends, whether they move on their own, and when they move, whether they have to move very suddenly, very immediately, or whether they can choose the time of their movement. So this distinction or this spectrum between migration and displacement covers a number of different kinds of decisions that people who move have to take. And it's a way of thinking about how much choice they have in those decisions. It's a way of thinking about whether it is simply a case of moving in order to survive, or whether it's a case of deciding to move for other reasons and that movement not being necessary, but being something that someone is choosing. As we go through this course, we're going to be looking at examples of human movement right across this spectrum. But because we're looking at the impact that climate change has on human movement, most of them are going to be towards the displacement end of this spectrum. That doesn't mean that we're going to be looking exclusively at forced movement, at displacement. We are going to be looking at patterns of migration as well. But this distinction, this spectrum with migration at one end and displacement at the other end, Representing how much choice people have about their mobility is a really key concept, and we're going to be coming back to it again and again in this session and over the course. The next really important distinction that we have to make when we're thinking about people moving, whether they are migrating or whether they are being displaced, is whether their movement is internal or cross-border. This distinction is really quite simple. Internal movement is when people move without crossing an international border, when they move within their own country. Cross-border movement is exactly that. It's when people cross an international border into another country. And this is a really important distinction for all kinds of reasons. When people cross international borders, their rights may be affected. They may not be treated in the same way that citizens of the country that they've moved into are protected or whose rights are respected. So people's experience of being in another country rather than the country that they are normally resident in is usually very, very different, often starkly different. So this difference between moving within your own country and crossing an international border is really key. It's also really important because people do not always have the right to cross international borders. In fact, for the majority of people who move from one country to another, they do not have the automatic right to cross an international border. So one of the key issues when we're thinking about cross-border rather than internal movement is whether someone is allowed legally to cross that international border. And the legality of their movement plays a huge role in their experience of making that migration, in their experience of making that move. So that's the second really important concept when we're thinking about someone's mobility, when we're thinking about someone who has moved, whether they have chosen to or not, is whether or not they have crossed an international border. The next really important thing that I want to think about is what the drivers of someone's migration or displacement are. And a useful way that I find of thinking about this is by splitting the drivers of people's mobility into different categories. For example, economic, political, social, and environmental. Now, over this course, over the year, our key focus is going to be on the environmental drivers and specifically climate change as an environmental driver of human movement. However, what is very clear from most of the evidence about climate-linked migration is it becomes very, very difficult to untangle all of these drivers from each other. So rather than thinking exclusively over this course about climate-linked migration or environmentally driven migration, rather what we're going to be doing in this session and over the whole year is trying to understand how climate change and other environmental forces affect people's migration. And that can be by affecting them directly, or it can be via these other drivers, such as the economy. So what I want to do now is just give you some examples of different kinds of human mobility that draw on these concepts. So for example, we could have cross-border movement, where someone has moved from one country to another and crossed an international border. And where that movement takes the form of displacement, where they have, for example, had very little choice about moving. Their displacement has simply been a case of choosing between moving and protecting themselves and surviving, or staying put and suffering the consequences of whatever is at hand. Their movement could be driven, could be pushed by some kind of political force, like a conflict. And this pattern of movement, cross-border movement, that takes the form of displacement, that has a political driving force such as conflict, is really what we're talking about when we think of the very common refugee movements that we see, where people are forced to leave one country and flee to another country, and the driving force behind their movement is armed violence. So what we've done there is taken what is a very common pattern of human movement and just analyzed it in terms of some of the basic concepts that we already have. So we can see that it's cross-border, we can see that it's displacement rather than migration, and we can see that the driving force is political, say, rather than economic or social or environmental. So for any given pattern of human mobility, one of the really important things to ask about that pattern, that group of people, that episode of movement is how does it fall within each of these concepts? Is it cross-border or not? Is it migration or displacement, or is it more like migration or more like displacement? And what are the driving forces behind that episode of movement? Are they broadly social? Are they political? Are they to do with conflict? Are they economic? Or, and as we will be focusing on today and over the year, are environmental factors at play in their mobility? So here's another example, just to kind of make this even clearer. We could have an episode of internal movement where people are moving without crossing an international border, moving within their own country. Their migration, their movement could be more like migration than displacement. It could be that they have an amount of choice about moving rather than being forced to move. And it could be that the driving force behind their migration is economic. So for example, they could be seeking work. And what we see here is another very common pattern of mobility. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people move within their own country, seeking work or seeking different work or seeking improved working conditions, higher pay, and people move from one place within their country to another. That's another very common pattern of human movement. And what we've done there is analyze that in terms of some of the key concepts that we've just looked at. So the key points are that they haven't crossed an international border, that they've had some kind of choice about their mobility, and that the driving force behind their mobility has been an economic one, and that economic driving force was them seeking work. Now, we could, of course, go on and illustrate kind of many hundreds of different examples using these concepts. I'm not suggesting for a second that these two examples in any way represent the full diversity of human mobility on the planet. My purpose here was simply to show you how to analyze two quite common forms of human movement using the concepts that we've just looked at, using these key distinctions between internal cross-border movement, using the distinction between migration and displacement, and then looking at the driving forces behind that mobility in terms of environmental, social, political, or economic factors. So what I want to do now is move on from looking at these concepts around human movement, migration, and displacement, and look at some kind of basic concepts and the basics of climate change. Okay, so this is something of a jump from one topic to another, and my apologies if it seems to be kind of leaping from one subject to another quite quickly. However, what we're going to do after we've looked at some basics of climate change is then draw these two areas together and look at how climate change is impacting on human migration. So let's begin looking at some climate change basics. Over the past few hundred years, there have been some important changes to our societies and our economies. And those changes have started to alter the makeup of the atmosphere. The consequence of that has been that the planet has started to warm. And we can expect that regardless of our actions now, the warming of the planet will continue over the next few decades and probably beyond that. There have been two really key driving forces in the warming of the planet. The first one is our extraction and burning of fossil fuels. So the extraction of coal, oil, and gas, and the burning of those fossil fuels in order to generate energy in power stations and in vehicles and across the world. It is by and large been fossil fuels that we have used to generate energy and drive the growth of our economies. So that's the first really key driver behind climate change. The second really important thing to understand, though, is that the warming of the planet and the increase of concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is not just about us burning fossil fuels. As you may know, it is our natural environment, plants, trees, that take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turn it back into oxygen. So changes in land use are really key in understanding this dynamic as well. And changes in land use, for example, the reduction in the amount of forest, has been one of the key drivers in our planet's ability to absorb the carbon dioxide that we've been putting into the atmosphere. So these two things have combined. Firstly, we've been extracting and burning more and more fossil fuels over the last century. And secondly, we have been reducing the Earth's natural carbon sinks. We have been reducing the Earth's ability to take that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turn it back into oxygen. So, through this combination of fossil fuel extraction and burning and changes in land use, we have increased the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the consequence of that has been that the planet has started to warm. It is also worth pointing out that while I've talked about this in rather general terms, I've sort of said that we as a planet have extracted and burnt fossil fuels, and we as a planet have changed patterns of land use. It has not happened in every country equally. What you can see from this map is greenhouse gases emitted per country per capita. The darker blue countries being ones where carbon emissions per person are higher. The lighter colored yellower countries are ones where carbon dioxide emissions per person are lower. And what this really shows you is that the responsibility for climate change, the responsibility for carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which are causing the warming of the planet, does not fall equally across all countries. It falls much more heavily with the countries which are now richer. And this is something really important to understand, because it is partly the very fact of extracting and burning those fossil fuels which has led to the rapid or speedier economic growth of those countries. Now I'm going to kind of move on from what is actually quite a big and important topic quite quickly. But we are going to return to this in, I believe, session 6, which is called Our Unequal World. And in that session, we'll be looking in much more detail about the uneven patterns of fossil fuel extraction and burning and carbon emissions across the world, and also the unequal impacts of climate change. So although this is really important, I want to kind of make a note here that we are going to be discussing these issues of the unequal distribution of both fossil fuel extraction, burning, carbon emissions, and the unequal impacts of climate change later on in the course. We'll be coming back to that in a lot more detail. Now, the consequence of the warming of the atmosphere, the warming of the planet, is that patterns of various weather patterns have begun to change. And this is really where we start connecting the dots between the warming of the planet and the movement of people. So what I've got here on the screen are just several of the ways, several of the consequences of the warming of the planet that we have already experienced. And I'm going to run through these just very quickly to kind of give you a sense of how they're connected. Now, of course, it's true that there have always been droughts. Drought has been a kind of feature of human societies for most of recorded history. However, what we see with the warming of the planet is that some of those droughts are becoming longer, are becoming more severe, or becoming more extreme. And therefore, those droughts are harder for human societies to cope with. Scientists have recently, in the last few years, been able to pinpoint with some accuracy which droughts have this connection to climate change. So which droughts have been made longer, or which droughts have been made more likely through the warming of the planet that has been created by the human emission of greenhouse gases. Another key consequence of climate change that we have already experienced some of and will experience more of in the future is sea level rise. And this is primarily created by, as the planet warms, the various stores of ice on the planet at the poles and in the Himalayas, the glaciers that exist all over the world, melt at a higher rate, and that water is eventually released into the sea, and the level of the sea rises. It's also the case that the frequency and severity of tropical storms is increasing. Now, tropical storms are a slightly broad phrase, and you probably know them as hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones. Now, these are actually all the same kind of weather event, but they're referred to generically as tropical storms. And these are the very, very destructive storms, for example, that we saw hit the Philippines in the form of Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, and Hurricane Katrina hitting New Orleans in the United States in 2005. So generically, cyclones, hurricanes and typhoons are referred to as tropical storms. It also seems, well, evidence indicates quite strongly that as the planet warms, some of these tropical storms are becoming more severe. We are more likely to have more of the very, very powerful storms that we've seen over the last few years. And with the increased power and increased frequency of those storms, inevitably comes the increased destruction that they create. Patterns of flooding also seem to be changing as a result of climate change. As the planet warms, it seems that the hydrological cycle of water evaporating from the planet and then raining back down onto it is changing too. And inevitably, this creates different patterns of flooding. So we're seeing this happening in various places across the world where unexpectedly extreme floods are taking place. So what we can see here from these impacts of climate change is that inevitably some of them are going to start to alter patterns of human migration and displacement. However, before we go on to look at that in more detail, we should also say that, of course, migration and displacement are not the only consequences of these kinds of events. They do, of course, affect people who don't move. They affect economies, they cause injury, and there are effects of these climate change impacts beyond human societies. Of course, there are wildlife, ecosystems, biodiversity are also severely affected by these changes in the atmosphere and then consequently by these climate change impacts. Now, that's a huge topic, but what we're going to do is move quite quickly on to thinking about how these impacts affect human mobility, affect migration and displacement. Now, one of the key concepts that we need to understand about these altered patterns of weather or about these weather-related disasters is the difference between slow onset and rapid onset disasters. So this is another key concept. This isn't a concept within the realm of human migration. This is a way of dividing up and understanding weather events or kind of weather-related disasters. So into slow onset disasters, we place things like drought and sea level rise. These are events which unfold over a number of months or perhaps even over years and decades. They're disasters that unfold slowly. That doesn't mean that they are not severe. It doesn't mean that their impacts are not felt very acutely by people, but they take perhaps years to fully unfold. And they sometimes come with warning. They are sometimes predictable. So the key kind of events that we're going to be talking about here that fall into that slow onset group are sea level rise and drought. Into the category of rapid onset disasters come things that unfold, as you might expect, very quickly. What we're talking about here is things like tropical storms and flooding. So with events like these, usually there may be only a few hours or perhaps a couple of days warning that this event is going to happen. And when it strikes very suddenly. In many cases, these kinds of rapid onset disasters don't persist for a particularly long time. For example, a cyclone or a hurricane will make landfall, cause a huge amount of destruction, and then dissipate fairly quickly. So the actual weather event itself if not the consequences of it, arrive and go very rapidly. The reason that we need to understand this distinction between slow and rapid onset events, slow and rapid onset disasters, is that usually they create very different kinds of human movement. So we now have a set of concepts, both in human movement and in climate change, that we can begin to use to unpick how climate change impacts are affecting human movement, and when they do, the kind of human movement that they are creating. So if we recap very quickly, we can look at an episode of human mobility and ask whether it is forced or voluntary, whether it is more like migration or more like displacement. We can ask whether people have crossed an international border or whether they have moved internally. We can ask what the key driving forces behind their mobility are. Are they political, like conflict? Are they environmental, like drought? Are they economic, like seeking work, changes in the economy? And where people are being forced to move by weather-related hazards, we can ask, are those weather events slowly unfolding, like drought, desertification, or sea level rise? Or are they rapidly unfolding events like hurricane strikes or flash flooding? So those are a set of concepts that we're going to use to try and understand how climate change and migration are linked and where they are the kinds of human movement that are created. So what we're going to do now is look at some of the patterns that are created by these climate-related weather events. The first one is displacement by sudden disasters. So if you recall our various concepts, what we're talking about here is displacement. So people who are forced to move, they have very little choice about moving. Moving is really about ensuring their immediate survival. And their movement is created, their displacement is created by a suddenly arriving disaster, like a hurricane or a flash flood. So what we're saying here is really that when sudden disasters arrive, when hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones, or flash floods arrive, when they do strike, what they do is create a form of human movement that is really like displacement. It's not really like migration. People are simply fleeing the disaster. They're leaving their homes and moving to somewhere else because they have little choice about doing so. When this does happen, what we usually see is people not moving very far. So this tends to create patterns of short distance internal displacement. The picture that you can see there is actually the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005. And what we saw in New Orleans, and what the kind of pattern that you get very frequently after these kinds of disasters is that is exactly what I've just described. People tend not to move far. They move to the place of nearest possible safety. They have very little choice about moving, so their movement is more like displacement. And usually they tend not to cross international borders, right? If the purpose of your movement is simply to protect your safety, is simply to get out of the immediate way of the impending disaster, or if you're moving actually as the disaster unfolds, the simplest thing, or possibly only your option, is to not move very far. So usually that means that people don't cross borders. Now, this is perhaps somewhat at odds with what a lot of people think that climate-linked migration is going to look like. So I think if you look at the media, if you look at the news headlines, you may have kind of come away from those headlines with an idea that when people move because of climate change, they're going to move huge distances across the planet, that they're going to be moving from one country to another, or maybe even from one continent to another. But actually, right now, one of the key forms of human mobility linked to climate change is this pattern of displacement resulting from sudden disasters where people actually don't move very far. The next pattern that I want to look at is human movement driven by the erosion of livelihoods. So what we're talking about here is, as some forms of climate change impact begin to change and worsen people's livelihoods, they may look to migration as a way of coping with that. Really what we're talking about here is the way in which drought will affect primarily people in rural areas who depend on farming, who depend on agriculture for their livelihood. So the way this relates to human movement is, if you take an area where people primarily work in farming, as problems like droughts begin to get worse, the income that people can make from farming begins to decline. And as that happens, some people will inevitably look for alternative work. People will look for work outside of farming, outside of agriculture, in order to support themselves and their families. Now, if they live in an area where there is a lot of alternative work, in an area where the economy is fairly mixed, where there are industries and commerce other than agriculture, it may be that they don't need to move in order to do that. However, there are lots of places in the world where an entire area is very, very dependent on agriculture. And in those cases, people will often have to migrate in order to find that alternative work. So what we see is impacts such as drought affecting the ability to grow and farm crops. As that begins to happen, the income that people can make from farming declines. The income that a farming business can generate declines. So either wages fall, or people are made redundant, or farmers take on fewer and fewer people. And inevitably, those people then have to seek alternative work. If there is work nearby, the likelihood is that people will take other nearby jobs. However, if there isn't work nearby, the likelihood is that people will migrate in order to find a different job. The pattern of migration that this creates, however, is again very often internal. If people can find a different job outside of farming without crossing an international border, then that is probably an easier and cheaper option for them. Crossing borders usually comes with expense and usually comes with risks. And if people can find a different job outside of the farming economy in a nearby town or city, then they will probably do that in preference to crossing an international border and seeking work in another country. Another reason that they're more likely to move internally is that they may or may not have the right to work in another country. So if they can move internally and find non-farm work, then that is the most likely migratory option that they will take. I've categorized this form of movement as more like migration. I'm not suggesting that the people who embark on this form of migration are wholly choosing to do so. To some extent, they are being forced to do so by the erosion of their livelihood by drought. However, in some respects, they have more choices open to them than people who are suddenly displaced by suddenly unfolding disasters. They may, for example, have more choice about where and when they move. It may be that they can decide when to move or who to move with. It may be that they can choose the town or city that they move to. So these are not necessarily choices that kind of make their movement completely free. They are still being forced to move, but they do perhaps have some agency. Some elements of their migratory process are still within their power. So while I would say this doesn't constitute kind of complete free movement, we can see that perhaps this falls somewhere different on this spectrum between migration and displacement that we looked at in the beginning. I don't want you to misread what I'm saying here. I don't want to imply that this is a freely chosen form of human mobility. However, nonetheless, we do have to distinguish it in some ways from the extreme forms of displacement where people have to move perhaps within hours or minutes in order to ensure their survival. The next form of movement that I want to look at, I feel, falls outside of either of these two forms that we've looked at so far. And this is the idea of planned relocation. planned relocation really is something quite different to these forms of migration and displacement that we've looked at already. And the key example that I want to look at here is when planned relocation is connected to sea level rise, and primarily when this takes place in the Pacific region. So one of the most kind of common sort of icons of climate-linked movement is this idea of Pacific island states, which are very low-lying, and the prospect faced by many of those islands, many of those countries, of having to move because with land masses that are only perhaps 1 or 2 meters above sea level, it is very likely that they will become uninhabitable within a number of decades. In some countries in the Pacific and some islands, this is already the case, and people are in some ways beginning to move already. However, my feeling is that planned relocation is a concept that sort of falls outside of these two existing patterns that we've looked at. In planned relocation, rather than moving in an ad hoc basis, rather than families moving one at a time, or individual people migrating to find work, or people moving in an emergency and chaotic fashion, as we've seen with displacement related to sudden disasters, planned relocation is rather different. It happens in advance, it's organized, as the word suggests, it's planned. And in these cases, a community or a town will, rather than waiting until they have no choice but to move, will look several decades ahead and accept that migrating, that moving may inevitably be necessary for them. And rather than doing it in ones and twos, one family at a time, they decide to move their community in its entirety, together, and establish the community again with its existing family and community ties in a location that's more safe. So again, this sort of falls slightly outside those patterns that we've already looked at. I think when it comes to thinking about whether it's migration or displacement, I think that's controversial as well. Clearly, decisions are being made, choices are being made. So I would say that it is a rather different form of movement to the kind of sudden displacement that we see as a result of sudden onset disasters. However, it's still the case that eventually these communities will have no choice but to move. However, by planning their movement in advance, they are to some extent taking control of the decisions rather than waiting for they're planning to migrate rather than waiting to be displaced. So from what we've looked at so far, we can begin to look at some of the patterns that are more and less likely. We can look at some of the migratory patterns that are more likely to result from climate change impacts, and some of the patterns that are less likely to result from climate change impacts. So in this category of more likely, we have internal movement. At the moment, it is more likely that climate change impacts will cause people to move within their own country, okay? What we see from sudden onset disasters is that people move internally and they move short distances. What we see from the impacts of slowly unfolding disasters like drought is that, again, people tend to move internally. They move from rural areas into cities to find work. It's also likely that these patterns of migration and displacement will be short distance. When people are moving to find work, or when they're moving simply to get out the way of an impending disaster, people tend not to move further than they really need to. So what we can expect initially at any rate is internal short distance movement. Another pattern which I think is often unexpected is that these patterns of migration and displacement are often circular. People move backwards and forwards between different locations. We see this especially in the context of drought. So as farming livelihoods become harder, as farming becomes more difficult, people will often move and find alternative work. But then perhaps as the drought temporarily alleviates and farming becomes easier, they will move back. And then if it becomes harder again, they will move back to the city to find a different job. So what you have, rather than a permanent migration, is people moving backwards and forwards from one place to another as the economy changes and perhaps as the patterns of drought change. Again, I think this kind of bucks the trend of what we have been told climate-linked migration will look like in the media. We tend to think that it's going to be across international borders, across continents, and that people's movement will be permanent. Whereas what it seems at the moment is that people's movement is internal, short distance, and then people are moving backwards and forwards between 2 or even 3 locations before settling somewhere permanently. It also seems from the existing evidence that a lot of the movement created by climate change impacts is rural to urban. So when we look at people who are affected by drought or desertification, what happens is that when they seek alternative work, they're seeking alternative work in cities. Now, urbanization is already kind of a global trend. Our cities are growing. The percentage of our population who are living in cities is increasing. And what we're seeing is that climate change impacts are affecting migration, and they are adding to this trend of urbanization. And they're adding to that trend of urbanization by playing a role in people moving from rural to urban areas. I should say, however, that although these are the more likely trends, I want to stress that these are the trends which exist at the moment. We've had some amount of warming already, and we've therefore begun to deal with some of the consequences of that warming already. And the trends that that warming has created are the ones that I've just described. However, what we don't yet fully understand is how those trends will alter in the future. What we can't say is whether these trends will persist as the planet warms even further, or when these trends will begin to change. So from those more likely trends, we can also sketch out some less likely trends. At the moment, cross-border movement is less likely than internal movement. It also seems less likely that people are going to cross continents. It also is less likely that people are moving en masse. What we see in many of these episodes of migration is that people are moving in 1s and 2s. Rather than a whole town suddenly upping sticks and moving, what we see is 1 or 2 household members moving to find alternative work, moving perhaps on their own, perhaps with a family member. And that rather than seeing a sudden en masse migration, the episodes of drought tend to create this movement in smaller numbers. We're also not at the moment seeing a great deal of movement between poor and rich countries. So I think in a way, some of these less likely bullet points illustrate some of the ways in which the media narrative about climate-linked migration has not been correct. We've tended to hear, as I've said, that people are going to move from poor to rich countries, that they're going to cross borders and even continents, and that this has been very much framed in the European and American Western media as being a driver of migration, of large-scale migration between poorer and richer countries. It's been framed very negatively as a kind of new migration crisis. However, what the evidence at the moment indicates is that that form of crisis-like migration from poor to rich countries across international borders is actually less likely than forms of internal migration and displacement in people moving from rural to urban areas within their own countries. Now, I need to stress that these are the more and less likely options that we're seeing at the moment. As I've said, as the planet warms further, we can expect some of these patterns to change, but what we don't yet know is exactly when they will. So we've done about 50 minutes. I think we should try and keep this session to about an hour. So what I'm going to do now is ask Leanne, who I have here with me, to summarize some of the questions that you've been asking on chat. It won't be possible for me to ask every individual question, but what Leanne has been doing is trying to put some of them together into categories, and I will try to address broadly some of the issues that you've been raising. So Leanne, if you can pitch me some questions that have been coming through.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So yes, Alex, and everybody, feel free to keep posting questions during Alex's Q&A. There have been some specific questions around the concepts that you've been talking about, which is great. So I think I'll start with those. There are also some questions around the legal side of things, which I understand is going to be in the future.
Yes.
So we'll see if we can get to some of those, but we'll start off with the questions that are really around what the focus of this session has been. So, for example, one of the questions was, so after Hurricane Maria, internal displacement in Dominica turned into cross-border movement.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the dynamics of sudden onset displacement shifting to cross-border movement?
Yes, yeah, I can. So I think, I mean, you're absolutely right that there are cases where a sudden event does create cross-border movement, and I think we're gonna see that increasingly in the future. Now, one of the key factors that dictates whether a sudden disaster creates internal cross-border movement is essentially the size of the country and how much of the country is affected by the disaster. So, for example, if we look at when we have typhoon strikes in China, which is a very big landmass, it tends not to create cross-border movement at all because people can move or are evacuated or helped to move, and there is a huge amount of the country which is not immediately impacted by the disaster that they can move to in relative safety. In countries that are much smaller, a much greater percentage of the country is directly impacted by the disaster, and in those instances you do see more cross-border movement. However, it's also the case that a kind of cap, to use a kind of metaphor, is put on that movement, because unlike with flows of refugees, there is actually no legal right to cross an international border because you've been affected by a disaster, right? It doesn't. Being forced to move by a disaster doesn't create a right to cross a border in the same way that fleeing a conflict or fleeing persecution does. So actually, what very often happens when people are forced to move and they are in a country that has a smaller landmass, they may well be wanting to cross an international border. They may well be wanting to find somewhere safe outside of their own country, but may well be prevented from doing that simply because legally they're not allowed to cross the border into the country that they would like to go to. So I think what our questioner here has raised is something really important, right? It's not purely the dynamic of the disaster itself that dictates whether people move across a border or not. It's all sorts of other factors to do with the size of the country, and whether neighboring countries are willing to allow people to cross the border and not technically seek refuge because they're not refugees, but to stay either temporarily or permanently in that third country after the disaster. Now, later on in the course, we are going to look in more detail at some of the legal issues around disaster displacement. And I think some of the issues about if and when and how people cross international borders in the context of disasters will come out when we look at those legal issues further down the line in the course.
Great, thank you, Alex. So there were also a couple of questions related to planned relocation.
Yep.
So one of them was, are there examples of planned relocation that are not climate change related? And another question around planned relocation, which was, could you provide any successful examples of planned relocation?
Okay, so I think in terms of examples and successful examples, the IOM, International Organization for Migration, now the UN Migration Agency, has done some really interesting work on planned relocation. And they have, I will put the link to this in the mailing that I send around next week. they have done some studies, done some case studies of how planned relocation has worked and some of the issues that it has raised. So yes, there are examples. Yes, it is happening. And I think the take home really from a lot of the work that's been done on planned relocation is one that it has to be approached really very cautiously. It is, of course, very possible to have to embark on planned relocation projects which are not successful, which cause problems for the people who are moving. And so I think that's a really important area of study, is beginning to understand, because it will become increasingly necessary, is beginning to understand what it is about how a community approaches a planned relocation, or how a government approaches a planned relocation that make them successful versus making them unsuccessful. I think, one of the really key things to understand about planned relocation is that we can look at cases where it has been very heavily driven by the community themselves, right? There are examples where communities have really taken the reins of the planned relocation. It has been, firstly, a decision by the community to relocate, and they have then, as far as possible, made the decisions about how that relocation happens. And I think those tend to be the ones that are successful. Now, there is also, right at the other end of the spectrum, things that you would call relocation or planned relocation, which probably or almost certainly constitute various kinds of human rights violation, right? So relocation is not a term that only covers these processes where people are making decisions, right? Now, what we've seen historically is a lot of forced relocations. They're planned, in that a government has planned them and then forced them to happen, taking place in order to make way for various kinds of development projects, often mining and hydroelectric dam projects. So the idea of relocation doesn't have necessarily a particularly positive history, right? So that means that there are two things when we're thinking about planned relocation as a result of climate change. The first one is that this idea of people moving may well, will for a lot of people come with like really negative baggage, right? It comes with the idea of relocation comes with all of the baggage of the unchosen rights violating relocations that have taken place in order to make way for development projects. So it's an issue that has to be approached very cautiously and very carefully. But what it does mean is that there has been, an awful lot of learning about how relocation can take place without those kind of rights violations. And I think the academic literature on it, draws quite heavily, firstly on people's experiences of being involved in, these quite negative relocations. And it means that there is already some established international law about if and when and how these kind of relocations can take place. Let's take maybe one more question, and then, okay, we'll do one more. And then I think what we'll do is wrap up the session. Leanne has your questions recorded in a document. And what I can do is I'll do one more now, and then I will try to include answers to your questions either in the mailing, or I will summarize them on the discussion forum on Facebook, and I'll answer some of them there in writing. But yeah, okay. If we go with one more.
Well, maybe just if there's only one more for now, maybe we'll end with one that was sparking a little bit of conversation in the chat just now, and it's about, why is there such a negative framing in the Western media in particular happening around, people who are refugees?
Okay. So I think maybe it's worth sort of giving a very quick overview of what a lot of the media coverage about climate-linked migration looks like, the tone that it takes, the kind of messages that it conveys, the way the whole issue is framed. In general, I would say that in the English-speaking media and in the kind of North American and European media, climate-linked migration is framed very much as potentially the next, quote, refugee crisis. And the reason for that essentially is that a lot of those media outlets already have an extremely problematic way of talking about migration and refugees generally, right? They view migration as a threat. They view migrants and refugees themselves as a threat. They've gone to great lengths to concoct kind of scare stories about migrants and refugees. They've kind of really pushed a framing. They've pushed a kind of extremely negative rhetoric around issues of human movement generally, right? So their starting point is not a very helpful one. And when they begin to think about how to cover the connections between climate change and migration, they have this pre-existing way of talking about migrants and refugees. And broadly, what has happened is that they are prepared to broadcast and write and talk about climate-linked migration, fitting it into their established way of talking about migrants and refugees. And that means that it then just borrows all of those existing phrases, it borrows all of those existing scare stories, it borrows all of those existing ways of talking about migrants and refugees, but it just presents them as kind of yet another driver of a future migration crisis. So I think when we want to understand why the press coverage about climate-linked migration has been so problematic, really the answer lies in the fact that within the English-speaking media, within European media, the way they talk about migration and refugees generally has been very problematic, and this has just been an extension of it. And that's why the tendency has been towards painting climate-linked migration as being something that very immediately is going to be driving huge numbers of people across international borders from poorer to richer countries. It's because that's, by suggesting that that's the kind of pattern that's going to take place, it's much easier to fit that into their existing way of talking and thinking and writing about migration more generally. There actually, over the course, we will be talking a bit about the way this is covered in the media, but we won't be focusing on it exclusively as a session. However, we do have some existing resources on the way that climate-linked migration is framed and the role that the media has played in that, which I will include in the mailing next week and which I will also post up on the discussion forum. So I think we've done just over an hour, so I think we should wrap up now. The final thing I want to do is thank you all for joining us for the live session, and to remind you that you can rewatch this session by following the same link whenever you want. You can also rewatch the previous session as well. And please do keep an eye out in your inboxes for the mailing, which will have links to the various things that we've talked about. And it will also have a new task that you can do if you wish to deepen your understanding of what we've looked at this time. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. Thank you, Leanne, as well, for being my co-pilot for this session and handling the chat and the questions. And I look forward to seeing you for next month's session.